As the war raged on across Europe, a small, coastal town in southern England found itself caught in a state of mounting dread. With each passing day, the horizon grew darker with the threat of invasion, and the town's inhabitants, once insulated from the horrors of the battlefield, were now painfully aware that their moment of reckoning was rapidly approaching. The men of the town, primarily young, had been called upon to defend the very shores they had once known as a place of peaceful respite. Now, as Nazi forces gained ground in Europe, the threat of a German invasion loomed large, pushing the people of this small town into a state of heightened tension. They could not escape the growing sense of inevitability, the understanding that their peaceful lives were about to be shattered by war. The soldiers, many of whom were still in their late teens and early 20s, had been hurriedly trained in the rudimentary arts of defense. Their rifles were almost an afterthought in comparison to the overwhelming weight of the fear they carried with them. They were not yet men in the truest sense, but rather boys who had been thrust into a world that demanded their maturity at a speed they were not prepared for. The officers who commanded them, some barely older themselves, understood the gravity of the situation, but their eyes betrayed their own anxieties, fears that had been buried beneath the polished veneer of duty and responsibility. They spoke of patriotism, courage, and the necessity of defending the homeland, but even they could not entirely silence the gnawing dread that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The town itself had not been fully prepared for the reality of war. Its citizens, for the most part, had carried on with their daily routines, unaware of how quickly the world outside would change. The streets were filled with merchants selling fresh vegetables, the distant chatter of children playing, and the soft sounds of the sea lapping against the rocky shores. It was a place that had always exuded calm, where time seemed to pass slower than in the more urbanized regions to the north. Now, the town's once idyllic landscape had become a theater for an impending storm. The buildings, once symbols of quiet comfort, were now fortified, their windows covered with sandbags, and the streets were eerily devoid of the usual bustling crowds. Everywhere you looked, there were signs of wartime preparations, as the town became a reluctant participant in a conflict that it had no desire to join. As night fell, the silence was punctuated only by the occasional rumble of military trucks rolling through the streets, their headlights cutting through the darkness like eerie searchlights. The soldiers gathered in small groups, their faces a mixture of fear, frustration, and bravado. They had trained in the basics, how to dig trenches, how to load a rifle, how to march in formation, but none of them had been prepared for what lay ahead. It was one thing to be taught how to shoot at a target. It was quite another to face the cold, unfeeling face of an invading army. For the young men, this was no longer a game. It was no longer about duty or bravery, it was about survival. In the hours before dawn, the soldiers and the civilians of the town alike waited with bated breath. The officers told them that the invasion could come at any moment. The sounds of distant artillery fire, the faint rumble of airplanes above, all seemed to signal the approaching storm. And yet, as the hours dragged on, nothing happened. The skies remained eerily still, the seas calm, the town as silent as it had been before the war ever began. The soldiers were tense, their hands clutching their rifles as if they might somehow summon the enemy through sheer willpower. They had been trained to expect the worst, to anticipate the sound of explosions and the chaos of battle, but the quiet was more unnerving than any noise could ever be. The waiting was unbearable, as though time itself had come to a standstill. The local townspeople, who had once lived lives of relative peace, now found themselves weighed down by a collective sense of anxiety. The familiar sights and sounds of their daily existence had been replaced by a constant sense of watchfulness. The town had become a place of unspoken fear, where every creak of wood, every shift of wind seemed to carry with it the potential for disaster. Families huddled together in their homes, unable to rest, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The men who had once worked in the fields or at the docks now stood watch, their faces drawn, their eyes tired but vigilant. Even the children seemed to understand that something was amiss, their usual carefree play replaced by an unusual quiet as they, too, became aware of the tension that surrounded them. In the early morning hours, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, there was still no sign of the enemy. The soldiers, despite their nerves, could not help but feel a strange sense of relief. It had been a restless night, filled with the weight of anticipation, but now, in the cold light of morning, the town felt almost serene. The usual sounds of the sea filled the air, the calls of gulls overhead a reminder of the normalcy that had once existed here. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire world had taken a collective breath, holding its posture in a kind of strange suspension. But even as the soldiers tried to relax, the uncertainty of the situation gnawed at them. The enemy had not yet arrived, but the knowledge that they could strike at any moment kept everyone on edge. In the town's central square, the officers held a meeting. The young men, unsure of what to make of the calm, listened intently. They were told that the invasion had not yet happened, but they could not shake the feeling that it would, and soon. What they did not know was that this sense of impending danger would stretch on for days, then weeks. The psychological toll of waiting, of being in a constant state of limbo, began to take root. There were no cries of war, no sounds of bombs falling from the sky, but there was still an undeniable sense of tension in the air. The soldiers began to question themselves. Had they been wrong? Was the enemy no longer coming? Or were they simply waiting for the right moment to strike? The uncertainty was maddening. Fear, once palpable and sharp, now became more insidious. It was no longer the fear of direct confrontation, but the fear of being in a state of perpetual readiness, never knowing if today would be the day the world erupted into violence. The officers, who had been the epitome of confidence in the days leading up to the invasion, now seemed uncertain, as though the weight of the waiting had begun to crack their composure. Some of them had already begun to lose their nerve. Their orders had been clear: prepare for an invasion. But now that it hadn't arrived, they too found themselves caught in a moral quandary. Should they continue to prepare for an attack that might never come, or should they begin to question whether their assumptions were wrong? The more they deliberated, the more unsure they became. The calm was not a comfort. It was a strange torment that made them wonder if they had miscalculated, if they had misunderstood the nature of their enemy. Were they overreacting? Or was the invasion still to come, but in a form that they couldn't yet understand? In every corner of the town, people began to ask the same questions. What was happening? Why had the enemy not come? Were they being spared, or was this just the calm before the storm? The longer they waited, the more unbearable the uncertainty became. The soldiers, who had once believed they were fighting for a noble cause, now struggled with the existential weight of their situation. They had no enemy to fight, no crisis to confront, and yet they were still there, trapped in the waiting, trapped in the uncertainty. The greatest enemy was not the one they had prepared for. It was the waiting itself, the quiet before the storm that had become louder than any battle they could imagine. The dawn broke slowly over the coastal town, and with it came an unsettling quiet that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. 4 days, the soldiers and civilians had been on edge, consumed by the fear of an impending invasion. But now, as the morning light crept over the landscape, there was no sign of the enemy. The air was still, the sea was calm, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore seemed almost foreign to the ears of those who had spent the past days listening for the rumble of tanks or the distant drone of enemy aircraft. The town, which had been filled with a sense of anticipation and dread, now lay frozen in time, its people caught between the hope that the danger had passed and the gnawing suspicion that something worse was yet to come. The soldiers, who had spent the night preparing for a battle that never arrived, were left in a state of confusion. They had been trained for war, drilled in the tactics of defense and combat, but nothing in their training had prepared them for this. The absence of the enemy felt like a betrayal of everything they had expected. They had been told to brace for the worst, to expect an invasion at any moment, but the silence that surrounded them was not the calm before the storm. It was a storm in itself, a kind of psychological warfare that twisted their minds and their perceptions of reality. The officers, too, were bewildered. They had been given orders to prepare for an attack, to ready their men for battle, but now they stood in the middle of the town square, watching the horizon with the same uncertainty as the soldiers they commanded. They had spent years training for moments like this, moments when courage, duty, and leadership would be tested by the harsh realities of war. But now, those same ideals felt hollow. They had expected the clash of steel, the shouts of soldiers in combat, the smoke of gunfire rising into the air. Instead, they were left to face the insidious reality of not knowing whether the enemy would come or whether they had been left to rot in a state of perpetual waiting. The civilians, who had long since abandoned the comfort of normalcy, were equally perplexed. The fear that had once gripped their hearts now gave way to a sense of frustration. They had heard the rumors, the stories of Nazi troops advancing across Europe, and they had feared for their lives, for the safety of their families. But now, with no invasion in sight, they began to question whether all of their preparations had been in vain. The streets, once filled with the sounds of daily life, now felt deserted. The marketplace, usually bustling with vendors and townspeople haggling over produce, was eerily quiet. Children, who had once played in the streets without a care in the world, now stayed indoors, their faces pressed against the windows as they, too, waited for something that might never come. Even the elderly, who had lived through the Great War and had seen the devastation it caused, found themselves unable to comprehend this new kind of fear, the fear of nothing happening at all. As the day wore on, the town began to settle into a strange new rhythm, a rhythm dictated not by the usual ebb and flow of life, but by the oppressive weight of uncertainty. The soldiers stood guard, their rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. They spoke in hushed tones, trying to make sense of their situation, trying to understand why the enemy had not arrived. Some clung to the hope that they had been spared, that the war would not touch their town after all. But even they could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to this silence than met the eye. The officers, too, wrestled with their own doubts. They had drilled their men for months, had prepared them for battle, for bloodshed, for the grim reality of war. But they had not prepared them for this slow, agonizing waiting. The lack of action, the lack of any real threat, was more disorienting than any battle could have been. The officers had expected to be in control, to be the ones issuing orders and directing their men to fight. But now they were no different from their soldiers, waiting, helpless, uncertain. There was no plan for this. There was no guidebook for what to do when the enemy simply didn't show up. And so they waited. They waited, not knowing whether their inaction would be seen as a sign of weakness or a strategic move. They had no answers, only questions that seemed to grow in number with each passing hour. In the town, the waiting took on a different quality. The streets, which had once been alive with the hustle and bustle of daily life, now felt like an alien landscape. The buildings, which had been fortified and prepared for an invasion, stood as silent monuments to the uncertainty that now gripped the town. The familiar sights of the town square, the church at the center of it all, and the old pubs where townspeople had once gathered to drink and talk, now felt distant, as though they belonged to another world. The usual sounds of the town, laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses, had been replaced by a haunting silence that seemed to suffocate every corner of the town. The lack of action, the lack of any external threat, seemed to make everything feel unreal, as though the town had been suspended in time, caught in an endless loop of waiting. As the day faded into evening, the soldiers grew restless. They had been told to remain vigilant, to expect the unexpected, but with each passing hour, the absence of the enemy seemed to mock their preparations. The tension that had once been palpable, the fear of an imminent assault, began to dissipate, replaced by a different kind of tension, the frustration of not knowing. The soldiers, whose faces had once been filled with resolve, now carried expressions of doubt. They had expected to face an enemy, to prove their courage and their worth. But instead, they were forced to confront something much more insidious, the fear of the unknown, the fear of waiting without knowing what was coming next. The officers, too, were beginning to feel the weight of their responsibility. They had led their men into this state of readiness, had prepared them for battle, but now they found themselves unsure of what to do. The war they had trained for had not materialized. The enemy they had prepared for was nowhere to be found. And yet the threat still lingered, just out of sight, like a shadow that refused to take form. The officers gathered in small groups, trying to make sense of their situation, but the answers were elusive. They had been trained to react to threats, to fight when the time came, but this was different. There was no enemy to fight, no battle to be won. Only the waiting. Only the uncertainty. As the sun set and the town was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the soldiers gathered in their barracks, staring out at the horizon. The calm of the evening was almost suffocating, a reminder that the enemy had yet to appear. Some soldiers tried to sleep, but the uncertainty kept them awake, tossing and turning in their beds, wondering if tomorrow would bring the assault they had been prepared for, or if they would wake up to yet another day of waiting. It was a kind of mental and emotional exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. The soldiers, who had been ready to fight, were now paralyzed by the absence of any action. They had no way of knowing whether they were being spared, or if this was merely the calm before the storm. The civilians, too, felt the weight of the waiting. They had once feared the invasion, but now, as the days turned into weeks, they began to wonder if they had been wrong to be afraid. The silence had stretched on for so long that it felt unnatural, as though the town was being held in a state of suspended animation, waiting for something that might never come. The familiar rhythms of life, working the fields, tending to the gardens, visiting the market, had all but disappeared. The people were left with nothing but their thoughts, nothing but the crushing uncertainty of not knowing when, or if, the war would finally reach their doorstep. And yet, despite the strange stillness, there was something that began to shift in the town. The absence of the enemy, the lack of any external threat, began to change the way the people thought about the war, about themselves. The fear that had once dominated their lives was slowly replaced by a sense of frustration, a sense of powerlessness. They had prepared for an enemy they could not see, and now they found themselves facing an enemy far more difficult to confront. The endless waiting, the sense that they had been abandoned, forgotten. The town had slipped into a state of eerie stillness, as if caught between the shadow of something great that might yet unfold and the heavy, oppressive calm of an uncertain present. The soldiers, having stood guard for countless days, their eyes trained on the horizon, found themselves now straining for a break in the monotony. They had expected the fear and confusion of battle, the chaos of gunfire and explosions, but what they were experiencing was something more insidious, a slow, suffocating tension that threatened to unravel them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The waiting had begun to take a psychological toll. At first, they had clung to hope, believing that the invasion was simply delayed, that the enemy was biding its time. But as days turned to weeks and nothing came, even that hope began to wither. The soldiers, who had once been driven by adrenaline and a sense of duty, now found themselves adrift, their bodies physically exhausted but their minds even more so. The strain of endless vigilance, with no clear threat in sight, was beginning to erode the fabric of their courage. The officers, once resolute in their leadership, were no better off. The calm was a challenge they had never been prepared for. They had drilled their men for combat, for sudden attacks, for the brutal realities of war, but they had not anticipated the fear that would settle in when there was no immediate enemy to fight. It was a different kind of battle, one fought within the mind. As the days wore on, the officers convened frequently, their meetings more about attempting to make sense of the growing frustration than about any real military strategy. They found themselves increasingly isolated, their authority no longer as unquestioned as it once had been. The soldiers who had looked to them for direction were now questioning their leadership. What if the invasion had been a false alarm? What if they had been duped into waiting for a threat that never existed? These were the questions that gnawed at the officers who had once felt sure of their place in this fight. Now, they found themselves weighed down by uncertainty, unsure of what to say to their men, unsure of how to restore the confidence that had once been their cornerstone. In the town, the civilians felt the weight of the waiting in their own way. At first, the anxiety had been an almost communal experience. Everyone had known that danger loomed close, that the war was coming to them. The fear was palpable in every street, in every house. But now, as the calm dragged on, that shared sense of dread began to fray. Some began to question whether there had ever been a threat at all. Had they, in their own fear, imagined the coming invasion? Or was the waiting simply a reflection of their own internal uncertainties? The town's leaders, once sure of their position in the war effort, now found themselves speaking in vague platitudes, offering reassurances that lacked substance. The men who had been preparing for battle now stood in the town square, unsure of what to do with their weapons, unsure of what their role was in a world where nothing happened. The streets, once bustling with the activity of daily life, now felt barren, as though the town had been put on hold, waiting for something that might never come. This collective waiting took on a strange quality, like a slow, creeping tension that infected every corner of the town. The sound of the wind through the trees, once a comforting whisper, now felt ominous. The distant calls of seagulls, once part of the natural soundtrack of life by the sea, now echoed in the silence, as though mocking the stillness that had descended upon them. The sea itself, which had always been a constant presence in their lives, now seemed distant and foreign. The soldiers, standing guard along the cliffs, their eyes fixed on the water, could not help but feel a deep sense of unease every time the tide shifted. It was as though the world around them had stopped making sense. The familiar rhythms of life had been replaced by a pervasive tension that lurked just beneath the surface of everything. In the homes of the townspeople, the unease was felt most acutely. For the first few days, there had been a sense of purpose, an understanding that something important was at stake. But now, as the weeks dragged on, the uncertainty became unbearable. The families who had gathered together, trying to comfort one another, found themselves falling into silence. The mothers who had tried to be strong for their children now found themselves questioning what they had prepared for. The fathers, who had once promised their families that they would protect them, began to wonder if their strength would be enough in the face of this waiting, this slow unraveling. The children, who had been shielded from the worst of the war, now began to sense the tension in the air. They saw the blank expressions on their parents' faces, heard the hushed tones in the conversations of the adults, and felt the unspoken fear that hovered like a storm cloud over their lives. As the days turned into weeks, the idea of waiting, of being suspended in a state of uncertainty, began to gnaw at everyone. It was not just the soldiers or the officers or the civilians, it was the entire town, caught in this strange limbo. There was no immediate enemy to fight, no visible threat to rally against. But that very absence of danger created a new kind of pressure, a quiet, insistent force that wore down everyone in its path. The young soldiers, who had been eager to prove their bravery, now found themselves consumed by an anxiety they couldn't name. They had been trained for battle, for action, but now they were trapped in a state of inaction, uncertain of their purpose and their place in the larger war. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound of movement, sent their hearts racing, only to find that there was nothing there. The fear had become internal, as if they were fighting an invisible enemy that was not defined by uniforms or weapons, but by the slow, constant erosion of their resolve. The officers who had once been symbols of authority now seemed diminished. They had been tasked with leading their men through the crucible of war, but the crucible had not arrived. They had no answers, no strategies for dealing with this strange absence of conflict. They too had prepared for battle, had steeled themselves for the brutality of war. But they had not prepared for this, the psychological strain of waiting without end. They tried to maintain order, tried to reassure their men, but the cracks in their own confidence were beginning to show. They, too, had begun to question whether they had made the right decisions, whether their preparations had been for nothing. The waiting had become its own kind of war, one that left no room for bravery or heroism, only confusion and fear. The town, once so full of life, now felt as though it were suffocating under the weight of its own indecision. The streets that had once been a place of connection, where neighbors exchanged greetings and children played, now seemed oppressive, each corner filled with the heavy expectation of something that might never arrive. The shops, once full of customers, now stood empty. The pubs, once full of laughter and conversation, now echoed with the silence of unresolved anxiety. The people who had once known what it meant to live in their small coastal town, surrounded by the rhythms of life, now found themselves caught in the unrelenting grip of uncertainty. They had been waiting for the storm to come, for the battle to begin, but now it seemed as though the storm would never break, leaving them to face the quiet horror of the unknown. In this state of waiting, the town had become a place where time itself seemed to stretch and warp. The days were long, filled with the constant tension of expectation, but they were also fleeting, as if the clock had slowed down, unwilling to let the people escape the grip of uncertainty. The soldiers stood, rigid and unmoving, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, but all they saw was the same endless stretch of sea and sky. The officers walked among them, offering reassurance that was empty, words that failed to stem the growing sense of doubt. The civilians, too, wandered the streets, their eyes downcast, their conversations marked by a quiet desperation. No one knew what to do, no one knew how to break the endless cycle of waiting. And so, they waited. The tension, once external, now lived within them all, a constant companion, more insidious than any enemy they had imagined. Weeks passed without incident, and the town, once a place of bustling activity, now wore an air of defeat. The soldiers who had expected to be thrust into the chaos of war found themselves trapped in a strange purgatory, suspended between the tension of imminent danger and the emptiness of a quiet, unresolved future. The enemy they had been preparing for, the invaders they had feared, were nowhere to be found. The war they had expected seemed to have bypassed them entirely. This strange lull, this pervasive calm, was more unnerving than any battle could have been. With no clear enemy to confront, the soldiers were left to fight their own minds, their own doubts. They stood watch, day after day, hoping for a sign of something, anything, that would justify the preparation they had endured. They had been taught that the fight would come, that they would be called upon to prove their courage, but now, as time stretched on and the silence became unbearable, they began to wonder if they had been wrong, if they had miscalculated, if they had been caught in a waiting game with no end. The officers, too, were beginning to feel the weight of this strange calm. At first, they had believed that the invasion was merely delayed, that the enemy was waiting for the right moment to strike. But as the days turned into weeks, their confidence began to erode. The men they had once led with a sense of purpose and clarity now looked to them with confusion, their faces marked by the strain of waiting without end. The officers had been trained for combat, for leadership in moments of crisis, but they had not been prepared for the psychological toll of this endless anticipation. They had no answers to give, no clear directives to issue. All they could do was stand alongside their men, trying to hold on to the same thin thread of hope that perhaps, tomorrow, the enemy would finally arrive. But the days dragged on, and the silence became more suffocating than any battlefield. The civilians, too, were deeply affected by the passing of time. Initially, they had feared the invasion, the arrival of foreign soldiers on their doorstep. They had believed, like the soldiers, that they would be swept up in the tide of war, that their lives would be changed forever. But now, as they went about their daily routines in the quiet, empty streets, they began to wonder if they had been wrong to fear at all. Were they foolish for preparing for a threat that never came? Was the war truly coming to them, or had it passed them by entirely? The sense of fear had dissipated, but in its place was something almost worse, a growing sense of confusion, of having been left in the dark. No one knew what to expect anymore, no one knew what to do with the time that had been given to them. Life, once so filled with purpose, now seemed to drift, disconnected and aimless. For many of the civilians, the soldiers had been their anchor. They had looked to the young men in uniform as symbols of strength and security. The soldiers were the ones who had been prepared to fight, to protect, to defend. But as the weeks dragged on with no sign of battle, the townspeople began to question the meaning of it all. The soldiers had been waiting just as they had, stuck in a loop of uncertainty. There were no more speeches about bravery, no more talk of duty. The soldiers, once proud and sure of their place in the war effort, were now shadows of their former selves. They wandered the streets, their faces drawn and tired, their eyes haunted by the same questions that plagued the minds of the civilians. What had all of this been for? What had they been preparing for? Had they been abandoned by the war, left to face their own doubts and fears alone? The town had become a place of suppressed emotion, a place where people spoke in whispers, afraid that if they voiced their doubts aloud, they would lose the fragile hope that they still clung to. The officers who had once been the ones to provide structure and guidance were now as uncertain as the soldiers themselves. The familiar roles had begun to break down. The lines between the men in uniform and the civilians had blurred. They were all in some ways in this together, caught in a web of waiting, a web that seemed to tighten with each passing day. No one had the answers, no one knew what would come next. The officers, Those who had once stood tall now seemed unsure of themselves. Their faces, once filled with the determination of leadership, were now marked with the same confusion that plagued their soldiers. They, too, had prepared for battle, had steeled themselves for the worst, but now they were left with nothing but a growing emptiness, the slow realization that the very thing they had been waiting for might never come. As time wore on, the soldiers began to adopt a different kind of resolve, one born not of heroism or courage but of sheer endurance. They no longer expected a grand battle or a moment of clarity. Instead, they focused on surviving the mental strain of it all. They had no enemy to fight, no cause to rally behind. The constant sense of unease began to feel like an insurmountable challenge in itself. They would stand their posts, watch the horizon, and continue to hope that, somehow, the invasion would come. But deep down, they knew that it might never happen. The days blurred together, and the soldiers found themselves losing track of time. Their lives had been reduced to an endless cycle of waiting, a waiting that seemed to stretch out like an eternal horizon. For the officers, the strain was even greater. They had been the ones to offer guidance, to provide a sense of purpose to their men, but now, as their own confidence slipped away, they found themselves questioning their role in all of this. What had they been training for? What had they prepared their men to do? They had all expected the clash of arms, the roar of war, but instead, they were trapped in a vacuum, suspended in a state of false anticipation. Some officers tried to rally their men, to speak of duty and honor, but their words felt hollow. The soldiers no longer listened with the same enthusiasm. The officers, in turn, grew more desperate, their words becoming less confident, less certain of themselves. The strain of this prolonged waiting had begun to take a toll on their ability to lead. They had come to see that leadership was not just about giving orders, about making decisions in the heat of battle. It was also about knowing when to act, when to step forward, and when to stand back. But now, in the absence of action, they had nothing to stand on but the thin hope that the war was still coming. The civilians, meanwhile, began to settle into a new kind of rhythm, one shaped not by the urgency of war but by the long, slow rhythm of time itself. They had learned to live with the uncertainty, to find ways to occupy their minds and their time while the world outside their town seemed to move on without them. But even in this new routine, there was an undercurrent of something more. The fear had disappeared, replaced by a quiet frustration, an understanding that they had been left in a state of suspended animation. The war had not come to them, and yet it had never fully left their lives. It lingered like a shadow, an unanswered question that hovered just beyond their grasp. The streets were still quiet, the marketplace still empty. The families who had once huddled together in fear now found themselves alone with their thoughts, unable to escape the growing realization that the war, for them, might never happen. It was in this atmosphere of unresolved tension that the British calm began to take shape. The stoic resolve that had once defined the nation's response to crises now settled in the hearts of the townspeople. It wasn't a calm born of peace or victory, but one born from sheer necessity. They had waited, and they would continue to wait. There was no victory to be claimed, no defeat to be mourned, only a deep, existential endurance. The soldiers, having long since let go of their dreams of glory, now accepted the waiting as their burden. The officers, too, adopted this quiet acceptance, their earlier uncertainty giving way to a kind of resigned calm. And the civilians, who had once feared the invasion, now understood that the real battle was not one of weapons, but one of time itself. The war, it seemed, had not come to their doorsteps. But it had come in a different way. It had come in the form of silence, of waiting, of a slow, invisible pressure that had shaped their lives in ways they had never expected. The British calm that had once been a symbol of stoic bravery in the face of war had now become a silent, enduring force in the town. It was not the calm of victory, nor of peace. It was the calm of endurance, of the ability to withstand the weight of uncertainty without collapsing. And as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the people of the town slowly came to accept that this, too, was part of the war they had prepared for. They had expected a battle to fight, but instead they were fighting something much more subtle, the weight of waiting, the strain of uncertainty, the battle to hold on to their resolve when nothing was certain.